The cabin buzzed with the low hum of passengers settling into their seats, overhead bins clicking shut, and quiet chatter as flight attendants moved swiftly down the aisle. Among them was Emily, a young and dedicated crew member known for her meticulous approach to her job. She was professional, but today something seemed to set her on edge. At the back of the plane, seated by the window, was an older man who exuded calm authority. His salt and pepper hair and straight posture hinted at a life of discipline and service. Raj Mehra, a retired Indian Army veteran, was no stranger to long journeys, but this flight was different. It wasn't the destination or the turbulence he anticipated, but the growing unease he felt in his gut, an instinct sharpened by years in the military. As passengers settled in, a subtle tension began to brew. Emily's sharp eyes darted toward Raj repeatedly, her expression unreadable. Something about him seemed to catch her attention. Perhaps it was the quiet confidence in his demeanor, or the simple way he greeted her when boarding, but it didn't sit well with her. She leaned over to whisper something to a colleague, her voice barely audible above the cabin noise. Raj noticed her glances but dismissed them. After years of serving in high-pressure situations, he had learned to focus on what mattered and ignore distractions. He adjusted the small pin on his lapel, a symbol of his service, and glanced out the window as the plane began to taxi. Minutes passed, but Emily's unease grew. She discreetly retrieved her phone and stepped into the galley. The sound of muffled voices followed, and soon after she returned, her face pale but determined. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing a short delay, but the real reason remained a mystery to most passengers. A few rows ahead, a young mother tried to calm her restless toddler, while a businessman tapped away on his laptop. Everyone seemed preoccupied, unaware that something unusual was unfolding. But Raj noticed the subtle shift. The way Emily avoided eye contact with him now, her hurried steps, and the faint whispering among the crew. Years of reading people had taught him to recognize when something was off. Before long, the murmurs turned into action. Emily approached Raj with a forced smile, accompanied by two uniformed officers who had just boarded. The atmosphere in the cabin changed instantly, curiosity giving way to confusion and alarm. Passengers craned their necks, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Sir, could you please step off the plane with us for a moment?" one of the officers asked politely, though his tone carried authority. Raj frowned but nodded, his composure intact. "May I ask what this is about?" he inquired, his voice calm but firm. Emily avoided his gaze, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her uniform. "It's just a quick matter we need to clarify," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Raj stood, his every move deliberate. He gathered his belongings, glancing briefly at the curious faces around him. As he made his way to the aisle, he couldn't help but notice the weight of Emily's stare, a mix of fear and uncertainty. But before he could step past her, the situation took an unexpected turn. Another passenger, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, spoke up. "Excuse me, but I've been sitting here the whole time. He hasn't done anything wrong." Her words were filled with conviction, cutting through the tension like a blade. The officers exchanged glances, clearly caught off guard. Emily stiffened, her confidence wavering as murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. More passengers began to voice their support, some standing to get a better view. "What's really going on here?" someone demanded from the back. The officers hesitated, but before anyone could clarify, the pilot's voice interrupted. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We'll resolve this quickly." But things were far from quick or simple. Just 5 minutes later, as the truth started to unravel, it wasn't Raj who left the plane under escort. To the shock of everyone, it was Emily. And the reason? That would leave the entire cabin stunned, sparking debates that would continue long after the plane reached its destination. The cabin fell into a stunned silence as Emily, the flight attendant who had initiated the commotion, was escorted off the plane. Her face was pale, her expression a mix of confusion and fear. Passengers watched in disbelief, their earlier murmurs growing into an audible buzz. What had just happened? Why had the situation taken such a drastic and unexpected turn? Raj Mehra, still standing in the aisle, slowly lowered himself back into his seat. His movements were measured, but his mind raced. He had no idea what had just unfolded, and while the immediate spotlight had shifted away from him, he was keenly aware that this was far from over. Years of military training had taught him to observe, assess, and act. But for now, he chose to remain silent, waiting for more information. Across the aisle, the kind-faced woman who had initially spoken up offered him a small nod, as if to say, "Asterisk, you're not alone in this asterisk." Raj returned the gesture with a faint smile, appreciating the solidarity in an otherwise bewildering situation. Meanwhile, in the galley at the front of the plane, the remaining flight attendants were huddled together, their whispers urgent and laced with worry. One of them, a senior crew member named Diane, looked particularly stressed. She had been with the airline for over a decade and had never seen anything like this. Her voice was barely audible over the hum of the engines. "This isn't how things are supposed to be handled," she said, shaking her head. Emily said she was concerned, but she didn't give any real details. She seemed convinced. Another flight attendant chimed in nervously. "But now, I don't know. Maybe she overreacted." Diane sighed and glanced at the cockpit door, where the pilot was likely receiving updates from ground control. Whatever had transpired, it was clear that the situation had escalated beyond anyone's expectations. And now, with Emily off the plane, questions about her actions and the reasons behind them were multiplying. Back in his seat, Raj's thoughts drifted to the moments leading up to the incident. He had noticed Emily's uneasy glances almost as soon as he boarded, but he hadn't thought much of it at the time. It wasn't uncommon for people to make assumptions about him based on his appearance, especially since he often wore his service pin, a small but significant symbol of his time in the Indian Army. He wore it with pride, not to draw attention, but to honor the sacrifices he and his fellow soldiers had made. He glanced down at the pin now, tracing its edges with his thumb. Had this simple emblem been the trigger for Emily's behavior? Or was there something else entirely at play? The questions swelled in his mind, but without answers, they only deepened the mystery. The other passengers, too, were trying to piece together what had happened. Whispers filled the cabin as people speculated and shared their observations. "I saw her talking to the pilot before the officers came on board," one man said to his seatmate. "Maybe she thought he was a security threat. But he's just sitting there, minding his own business," a seatmate replied. "Doesn't make any sense." In the row behind Raj, a teenager with headphones pulled halfway off his ears leaned toward his father. "Do you think she got fired?" he asked in a hushed tone. "Hard to say," the father replied. "But whatever it was, it must have been serious for them to take her off like that." As the minutes ticked by, tension hung thick in the air. The pilot finally addressed the passengers again, his calm voice a stark contrast to the confusion below. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We've resolved the immediate issue and will be departing shortly. Please remain seated and fasten your seat belts." The announcement brought some relief, but it did little to answer the burning questions on everyone's mind. For Raj, the pilot's words felt hollow. The immediate issue might have been resolved, but the larger mystery remained. The plane finally began to taxi toward the runway, and as the engines roared to life, Raj closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to center himself. He replayed the events in his mind, searching for clues or context he might have missed. Emily's behavior had been strange from the start, but her decision to involve the police, and her subsequent removal, hinted at something far more complex than a simple misunderstanding. Raj's thoughts were interrupted by a soft tap on his arm. He opened his eyes to find the kind-faced woman from earlier leaning slightly into the aisle. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice tinged with concern. "Are you all right?" Raj nodded, offering her a small smile. "I'm fine, thank you. And thank you for speaking up earlier. That was very kind of you." The woman smiled back, though her eyes held a trace of worry. "I couldn't just sit there and say nothing. It didn't feel right." Before Raj could respond, a flight attendant approached their row, her expression apologetic. It wasn't Diane, the senior crew member, but a younger attendant who looked equally uneasy. "Sir," she began, addressing Raj directly, "I just wanted to say we're very sorry for the inconvenience earlier. If there's anything you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." Raj sullied her face for a moment, searching for any hint of additional information, but she seemed genuinely remorseful, and he decided not to press her. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone polite but reserved. The flight attendant nodded and retreated to the front of the cabin, leaving Raj and the passengers around him to stew in their unanswered questions. As the plane lifted off into the sky, Raj leaned back in his seat, letting the steady hum of the engines fill the silence. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, more than Emily's apparent overreaction or the vague apologies from the crew. Something had triggered her behavior, and while he couldn't yet piece it together, he was determined to find out the truth. What Raj didn't know was that the events on this plane would soon ripple far beyond the confines of the cabin. By the time the flight landed, the incident would already be making headlines, sparking debates and dividing opinions. And at the center of it all would be a question that no one could yet answer. What really happened in the moments leading up to Emily's fateful decision? As the plane cruised steadily at 35,000 feet, the hum of the engines provided a backdrop to the muted conversations and restless shifting of passengers. While some tried to distract themselves with in-flight entertainment or books, others kept sneaking glances toward Raj, curiosity written all over their faces. The incident with Emily lingered in the air like an unresolved question no one could ignore. Raj, for his part, remained composed, but his mind churned with possibilities. It wasn't just about what had happened, it was about why. He replayed the moments from the boarding gate to the cabin over and over, trying to find any detail he might have overlooked. Had he done something to alarm Emily? Was it something he said or how he looked? The lack of clarity gnawed at him. Seated a few rows ahead of Diane, the senior flight attendant was quietly speaking with another crew member. Their hushed tones suggested an attempt to debrief what had unfolded, but the occasional glance back toward Raj indicated they, too, had unanswered questions. "What exactly did Emily say to you before all this started?" Diane asked the younger attendant, who had been working in the same section as Emily. "She said she had a bad feeling," the younger woman replied hesitantly. "She didn't explain much, just that she thought he might be dangerous." Diane frowned. "Dangerous how? Did she see something specific?" The younger attendant shook her head. "No, she just seemed really certain. But now I'm wondering if she misunderstood something." Diane sighed deeply, leaning back in her seat. The situation was a mess, and as the most experienced crew member on board, she felt the weight of it pressing down on her. Emily's actions had not only disrupted the flight, but also left the rest of the crew scrambling to manage the fallout. And then there was the matter of Raj. He had been nothing but calm and cooperative throughout the ordeal, which only added to the confusion. Meanwhile, at the back of the plane, Raj found himself in an unexpected conversation. The teenager who had been whispering to his father earlier had mustered the courage to speak directly to him. "Hey," the boy said, leaning forward in his seat. "Are you like in the military or something?" Raj turned to him, surprised but not annoyed. "I was," he replied with a small smile. "I served in the Indian Army for many years. I'm retired now." "Cool," the boy said, his eyes widening. "Did you like fight in wars and stuff?" Raj chuckled softly. "Something like that," he said. "But it's not as glamorous as it sounds. Mostly, it's about discipline and service, protecting others." The boy's father intervened gently. "Don't bother the man with too many questions, Sam." "No, it's fine," Raj assured him. "Curiosity is a good thing." As Sam settled back into his seat, satisfied for now, Raj felt a flicker of warmth. The brief exchange had momentarily distracted him from the unease still swirling in his mind. But that unease returned when Diane approached him with a cautious smile. "Mr. Mehra," she began, her voice quiet but firm, "I just wanted to check in and see if you're doing all right. I know today's events have been unusual." Raj nodded, appreciating her professionalism. "I'm fine, thank you. That I would be lying if I said I wasn't curious about what led to all of this." Diane hesitated, clearly weighing her words carefully. "I can't share all the details right now, but I can assure you we're taking this very seriously. If there's anything you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to let us know." Her response, though polite, left Raj with more questions than answers. He could see the discomfort in her eyes, the way she avoided specifics. She knew more than she was letting on, but either she couldn't share it, or she didn't want to. Either way, it added another layer to the growing mystery. Back in the galley, Diane took a moment to compose herself. She couldn't shake the feeling that something about Emily's actions didn't add up. Emily had always been a bit high-strung, but she was also known for being thorough. If she had acted on a hunch, it must have been a strong one. But was it justified? Or had fear clouded her judgment? As the flight continued, small fragments of the story began to emerge from passengers who had overheard snippets of conversations or caught glimpses of the initial incident. A man seated near the front claimed he had seen Emily looking at her phone just before she alerted the pilot. Another passenger said they had overheard her mentioning something about a red flag, though they couldn't make out the details. Each piece of information added to the growing puzzle, but none of it provided a clear picture. For Raj, the lack of clarity was frustrating but not surprising. Over the years, he had learned that fear and misunderstanding often went hand in hand. Still, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to this than a simple mistake. Unbeknownst to the passengers, the ground crew at the airline's headquarters was already digging into the incident. Security footage from the boarding gate was being reviewed, and Emily's recent actions were under scrutiny. What had prompted her to call the police? And why had her behavior seemed so erratic afterward? The answers, when they came, would only deepen the mystery. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin shifted slightly. For some passengers, the focus moved to the usual routine of preparing for landing. But for others, especially those who had been paying close attention, the unresolved questions lingered. Raj remained calm, but his mind was already working on what he would do next. He knew this wasn't over, not for him and not for Emily. The flight finally touched down, and as the wheels screeched against the runway, a sense of relief washed over the passengers. But for Raj, Diane, and the rest of the crew, the landing was just the beginning. Whatever had sparked the day's events was far from resolved, and the truth, whatever it was, would soon come to light in ways none of them could have anticipated. The plane rolled to a stop at the gate, and the seatbelt signs clicked off with a familiar ding. Passengers sprang to their feet, eager to grab their bags and escape the tension that had shattered the flight. But for Raj, there was no such relief. He remained seated, his hands resting calmly on his lap, though his mind was far from at ease. Around him, snippets of conversation floated through the air, tinged with curiosity and speculation. People weren't just talking about the usual post-flight grumbles or travel plans. They were dissecting the events of the flight, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. "You think she just panicked?" one man asked his companion. "Maybe, but why? What could she have seen that made her act like that?" The other replied. Raz's ears caught fragments of these exchanges, but he tuned them out. He had learned over the years that speculation without facts was a distraction. Instead, he focused on observing. He noticed Diane at the front of the plane, speaking with the pilot. Their body language was tense, their expressions serious. Whatever they were discussing, it was clear that the incident was far from resolved. The passengers began filing out, and Raj finally stood, collecting his bag with deliberate movements. As he stepped into the aisle, Diane approached him again, her face a mixture of professionalism and concern. "Mr. Mehra," she said softly, "if you have a moment, the ground crew would like to speak with you." Raj raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Of course." Diane gestured toward the jet bridge, where two uniformed airline staff members waited. They were flanked by an airport security officer, whose presence added an unspoken weight to the situation. Raj followed Diane off the plane, aware of the curious eyes trailing him. The waiting area outside the plane was quiet. the usual bustle of the airport muted by the tension in the air. The airline staff introduced themselves quickly, their tone polite but brisk. The security officer remained silent, his presence a reminder that this was no ordinary post-flight debrief. "Mr. Mera," one of the staff began, "we want to apologize again for the events that occurred during the flight. We've been reviewing the situation, and there are some details we need to clarify." Raj nodded, his expression calm. "I'm happy to answer any questions." The staff exchanged a glance before continuing. "We understand that Emily, the flight attendant who raised the concern, believes she saw something suspicious. However, we're still trying to determine what led her to make that assumption." Raj tilted his head slightly, his curiosity piqued. "Did she give any specific reason?" "She mentioned your lapel pin," the other staff member admitted hesitantly. "She said it caught her attention and that it looked unfamiliar. She claimed it might have been a symbol related to, well, to something concerning." Raj's eyes narrowed slightly, though his expression remained composed. "My lapel pin." He reached into his pocket and held it up, letting the small symbol catch the light. "This is a regimental badge from my time in the Indian Army. It's a symbol of service, nothing more." The staff members looked visibly uncomfortable, realizing the weight of their earlier assumptions. "We understand that now," one of them said quickly. But at the time, it seems Emily misinterpreted its meaning. Raj let out a slow breath, his patience strained but intact. So her reaction was based on a misunderstanding. The staff hesitated, and it was Diane who finally spoke up. "It wasn't just the pin," she said carefully. "Emily had been acting unusual for a few days. She mentioned feeling uneasy about certain passengers, not just you. We think this might have been the tipping point." The mention of Emily's unease added a new layer to the puzzle. Raj frowned, considering the implications. Was this simply a case of paranoia? Or was there something deeper at play, something that went beyond a single misunderstanding? Before he could respond, the airport security officer finally spoke, his tone measured. "Mr. Mera, I've reviewed the security footage from the boarding area. There's no indication that you or anyone else posed a threat. However, we'd like to take your statement for our records." Raj nodded, appreciating the officer's straightforward approach. As he recounted the events of the flight, he couldn't help but notice the growing discomfort among the airline staff. They seemed torn between acknowledging their mistake and protecting their own. When the interview concluded, the security officer extended a hand. "Thank you for your cooperation, sir. I'll make sure this is documented properly." Raj shook his hand, his grip firm. "I appreciate that." As the officer stepped away, one of the airline staff turned to Raj, their expression earnest. "We deeply regret the inconvenience this has caused you. Please know that we'll be conducting a thorough review of Emily's actions." Raj nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture was still incomplete. What had driven Emily to act the way she did? Was it truly just a misunderstanding? Or was there something she wasn't saying? As he left the restricted area and entered the bustling terminal, Raj couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. The incident had left too many unanswered questions, and he wasn't the only one searching for answers. Somewhere out there, Emily was likely grappling with the consequences of her actions. And whatever the truth was, it was bound to come to light, sooner or later. The terminal buzzed with life, but for Raj, the world felt quieter. He walked toward the exit, his mind still racing. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a larger issue. A clash of fear, perception, and the weight of assumptions. And as he stepped into the cool evening air, he knew that the resolution, when it came, would reveal far more than anyone expected. As Raj stepped into the terminal's cool evening air, a faint sense of unease lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. The incident on the plane should have been over, a closed chapter. But instead of clarity, there was a nagging feeling that something larger was at play. He had barely taken a few steps toward the taxi stand when his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw an unfamiliar number on the screen. Normally, he would have let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. "Mr. Mera?" The voice on the other end was calm but deliberate. "This is Officer Daniels. I was the security officer you spoke with after your flight." Ray's brows furrowed. "Yes, officer. Is there an update?" There was a slight pause before Daniels continued. "I need to ask you a few more questions, sir. Something new has come to our attention, and it's important we clear it up." Ray's grip on his phone tightened. "What sort of new information?" Daniels hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "We reviewed additional footage from the boarding area. It appears that Emily wasn't just observing you. She had been watching another passenger too, a man seated 2 rows behind you. And there's more. That passenger didn't board the flight." Raj stopped in his tracks, his mind racing. "Didn't board? What does that mean?" Daniels sighed. "He passed through security, checked in at the gate, and was assigned a seat. But for reasons we're still investigating, he never got on the plane. Emily seemed to be tracking him too, right up until the boarding call. It's possible she mistook your presence as connected to his." The revelation hit Raj like a wave. The tension during the flight, Emily's erratic behavior. It suddenly seemed like there was more to the story than a simple misunderstanding. "Do you know who this man is?" Raj asked. "We're still looking into it," Daniels admitted. "But there's something else. His checked luggage was removed from the plane before takeoff. Standard procedure for a no-show. The issue is, we ran the bag through additional screening, and it contained, well, let's just say items that raised concerns." Raj's stomach churned. "What kind of items?" "I can't disclose specifics right now," Daniels replied, "but enough to warrant a deeper investigation." The pieces of the puzzle started to shift in Raj's mind. Was Emily's behavior driven by paranoia, or had she noticed something that others missed? And if this mysterious passenger had indeed raised red flags, how had he slipped through security in the first place? Daniels broke into Raj's thoughts. "I know this is unsettling, but I wanted to keep you informed. Given your proximity to the situation, you may be contacted again as we dig deeper." Raj nodded to himself, his voice steady despite the unease creeping into his chest. "Thank you for letting me know, officer. I appreciate it." As the call ended, Raj remained rooted in place, his mind racing with questions. The man who hadn't boarded the flight. Who was he? And why had Emily's attention been divided between him and Raj? It was as if the simple explanation he had hoped for was slipping further out of reach, replaced by a web of uncertainties. He finally hailed a cab and slid into the back seat, but even as the city's lights blurred past the windows, his thoughts were elsewhere. There was something unsettling about being at the center of a situation with so many unknowns. He had faced high-stakes situations during his military career, but this felt different. Less tangible, yet no less urgent. Elsewhere, in a small office at the airport, Emily sat across from 2 airline supervisors, her hands gripping a paper cup of water. She looked exhausted, her normally neat uniform slightly rumpled. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning, but the weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air. "Emily," one of the supervisors finally began, his tone measured, "we've been reviewing the footage and your account of the incident. There are discrepancies." Her grip on the cup tightened. "Discrepancies. I told you what I saw." The other supervisor leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but firm. "You mentioned the passenger with the lapel pin. But why didn't you report the man 2 rows behind him? The footage shows you watching him before boarding." Emily's face paled. "I didn't think he was a threat." "But you thought Mr. Mera was," the first supervisor pressed. "Emily, this is serious. We need to understand what led to your actions." She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. "I wasn't sure," she admitted finally. Something about the man behind him felt off. But when I couldn't find anything concrete, I convinced myself I was overreacting. Then I saw Mr. Mera's pin, and it triggered something. I thought. She stopped, shaking her head. "I thought I was doing the right thing." The supervisors exchanged a look, their concern evident. It was clear Emily wasn't being entirely forthcoming, but whether it was out of fear, guilt, or something else, they couldn't be sure. As the cab pulled up to Raj's hotel, he stepped out, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He entered the lobby, nodding politely at the receptionist before heading to his room. Once inside, he set his bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. He couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was far from over. Somewhere out there, the truth was unraveling. And whether it came from the no-show passenger, Emily's fractured recollection, or the investigation into the suspicious luggage, Raj knew one thing for certain. The answers wouldn't just clarify what had happened. They would change everything. Raj's room was dimly lit, the muted hum of the city filtering in through the window. He sat on the edge of the bed, his thoughts swirling like a storm. The call from Officer Daniels had given him more questions than answers, and the weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on his chest. Just as he considered reaching out to the airline for further clarification, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message. A single line that sent a chill down his spine. "Meet me in the lobby. I need to explain everything." Emily. Raj stared at the screen, his mind racing. Emily. What could she possibly have to explain? He hesitated for a moment before standing, his curiosity overpowering his caution. He grabbed his jacket and made his way downstairs. The lobby was quiet, save for the faint clatter of dishes from a nearby cafe. Sitting in the corner, partially hidden behind a potted plant, was Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously around the room. When she spotted Raj, she stood quickly, wringing her hands. "Mr. Mehra," she said softly, her voice tinged with both relief and anxiety. "Thank you for coming." Raj nodded, his expression neutral. "What's this about, Emily? Why did you contact me?" She glanced around, as if ensuring they weren't being overheard. "Can we talk somewhere private? Please." Raj hesitated, but eventually motioned toward the cafe. They sat at a secluded table, and Emily leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made a mistake," she admitted, her words tumbling out in a rush. "But it's not the mistake everyone thinks. It's worse." Raj's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning. "Start from the beginning." Emily took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "I noticed that man, the one who didn't board the flight. Long before the gate, he was acting suspicious, checking his phone constantly, looking over his shoulder. I thought he might be planning something, but I couldn't be sure. Then, just before boarding, I saw him hand something to another passenger, a woman who sat 2 rows behind you." Raj's pulse quickened. "And you didn't report it?" "I tried." Emily's voice cracked, drawing a disapproving glance from a nearby patron. She lowered her voice. "I went to the gate agent, but they brushed me off. Said I was overthinking it. By the time we were boarding, I was second-guessing myself. Then I saw you." Raj frowned. "What does that have to do with me?" Emily looked down, ashamed. "Your pin. It reminded me of something I'd seen in a training video about international symbols and potential risks. I know now I was wrong, but at the time, I panicked. I thought you might be connected to him." Raj leaned back, his jaw tightening. "So you focused on me instead of the real threat." Emily nodded miserably. "I was wrong, and because of me they got away. But there's more. After the flight landed, I checked the passenger manifest again. The woman who sat behind you. Her name was flagged by security. She's under surveillance for smuggling. Whatever the man handed her, it's gone now." The pieces of the puzzle snapped together in Raj's mind. The missing passenger, the mysterious exchange, the no-show luggage. It all pointed to something much larger than a misunderstanding. "And the man's luggage?" Raj asked, his tone sharp. Emily hesitated. It was a diversion. There was nothing dangerous in it, just odd electronics to trigger suspicion. They wanted to distract security from what was happening in the cabin. Raj exhaled slowly, the weight of the revelation sinking in, and he let it happen. Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "I didn't mean to. I thought I was doing the right thing." Before Raj could respond, his phone buzzed again. It was a call from Officer Daniels. He answered, his voice tight. "Daniels, what's happening?" "We've tracked down the no-show passenger," Daniels said, his tone grim. "Turns out he's linked to an international smuggling ring. They've been using commercial flights to move contraband through unsuspecting passengers. We're still piecing it together, but it looks like the woman on your flight was a mule." Raj glanced at Emily, who was staring at him with wide eyes. "And the man?" "He's in custody now," Daniels replied. "But the contraband is gone. It must have been passed to the woman before he skipped the flight. We're coordinating with other agencies to track her down." Raj hung up, his mind racing. The smuggling operation, Emily's misjudgment, the lost contraband. It all felt like a dangerous game of cat and mouse. And yet, the nagging feeling there was still more to the story lingered. As he turned back to Emily, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, and her face drained of color. "It's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The man from the airport. He just sent me a message." Raj's heart pounded. What does it say? Emily held up the phone, her hands shaking. The message was chilling in its simplicity. Asterisk, asterisk, you should have kept quiet. Asterisk, asterisk. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was electric, the weight of the situation pressing down on them both. Raj stood, his military instincts kicking in. "Emily, you're in danger. We need to contact Daniels immediately." But even as he spoke, Raj couldn't shake the feeling that the man's reach went deeper than any of them realized. And as they left the cafe together, the shadow of the smuggling ring loomed larger than ever, a reminder that some battles are fought in the shadows, where the stakes are higher and the enemy is unseen.